I was 20 years old, she wrote, joyfully awaiting the birth of our second child. Almost 24 hours into labor, the baby began to appear stressed. My doctor told me they were going to have to use high forceps because the baby had to come out, and there was no time for any form of anesthesia or sedation. I had no idea anyone could experience that much pain. I closed my eyes and let out a scream of sheer terror. Suddenly, I opened my eyes and saw in front of me a wall that seemed to stretch as far as I could see with no end in sight. The next thing I knew, I was looking back and the wall was behind me. I turned around and saw a hill. That was the most amazing color green I had ever seen. It had a brightness and brilliance that I've never seen again in my 67 years of life, like nothing experienced on earth. It was accompanied by a sense of warmth and utter peace that was unimaginable. I was experiencing sheer joy, though I'm not sure joy describes it well. It was more like a total sense of relief and safety, of being home. There was nothing else present except that hill, and then a brilliant light appeared on the other side. I knew I was about to see Jesus or God, and I was compelled to walk to the light with an urgency and longing that there are no words to describe. I've always said there's no greater love than a mother for her children, but this love that compelled me was at a different level altogether. The need to be with the light was all that mattered. Just as the light began to reach the crest of the hill, I realized I was being shaken by my doctor saying, "You have to come back with us, don't let go." I reached out to push him away, yelling, No, I have to go back." It was all noise and pain again. I remember them telling me I had a baby girl to take care of, but I didn't feel I belonged here anymore at all. Afterward, I was joined by my husband and my new daughter for the first time. I began to realize I needed to stay here, that my role on earth was not complete. I got busy once again as a wife and a mother. The joy of motherhood returned. The details of that world remain sharp in my mind, and I can recall the feelings, though I've never been able to feel them again. The warmth and calm in the place beyond the wall. I can only hope and pray that when it is time, I'll return to the world full of peace that I know exists. I've been there. Well, since I retired this spring, I've enjoyed going on long walks in the morning, well, at least the mornings that I don't play pickleball. Now, if you're over 50 and hear that, you say, well, that sounds like great exercise. But if you're under 30, you think, yeah, long morning walks and pickleball, that's nice, Grandpa, go eat your pudding. But either way, when I'm out walking, I like to listen to podcasts to help pass the time. And one morning recently, I stumbled upon a talk by Annika Harris, the wife of Sam Harris, and a renowned atheist and science writer in her own right. The talk was entitled, "The Illusion of Self." And in it, she talks about consciousness and what we consider free will, suggesting that neither of these actually exist, but are simply illusions created purely by neurochemical processes within the brain. Interesting, debatable, certainly, but that's not what caught my attention, really. Instead, I was struck by the fact that in a 17-minute talk, she stated no less than 3 times that we know consciousness is the product of the brain, and we know consciousness is identical to the brain. Now, whenever I hear a scientist claim we know, my STEM education radar goes off, just like when someone serves up that oxymoron, settled science. Because at the very core of science is skepticism, the humble realization that we don't know anything and that nothing will ever be settled. As Carl Sagan said, certainty will always elude us. And never in science, ironically, has this been better illustrated than in the case of consciousness. The question of why and how humans, and perhaps other organisms, have subjective experiences and awareness of self. This has been called the hard problem of consciousness, and although that term wasn't coined until the 1990s, it's baffled science for literally centuries past and seems no closer to a solution in the 21st. At the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness meeting in 1998, neuroscientist Christoph Koch bet philosopher David Chalmers a case of fine wine that a clear signature of consciousness would be found in the brain within 25 years. But 2023 found Chalmers enjoying that wine at Koch's expense. Koch had to concede that no evidence of consciousness originating in the brain had been found, and that remains true today. Contrary to the claims in Ms. Harris's podcast, cognitive psychologist Donald Hoffman, one of the leading experts in the field, has stated, quote, "No one has come up with even a remotely plausible theory to explain how the brain produces consciousness," end quote. Dutch physician, researcher, and author Dr. Pim Lummel agrees, writing, "We have to acknowledge that it seems impossible to reduce all consciousness to neural processes." And so the question, if there is to date no evidence of a source of consciousness within the brain, is there any scientific evidence for consciousness originating outside the brain? Well, my answer, surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly to many of you, is a resounding yes. I say it might not be surprising because those of you who have heard me speak here before may remember a talk I gave on quantum physics experiments, which suggest, not prove, mind you, but suggest that consciousness is not a product of the physical world, but the cause of it. However, quantum physics admittedly describes a sub-microscopic world in which the physical laws of our macro world often don't seem to apply, and it's a scientific field that is so bizarre and counterintuitive that even one of its founders, Richard Feynman, has stated, "If you think you understand it, then you don't understand it." Could there be evidence, scientific evidence, of extracorporeal consciousness? In other words, consciousness that exists independently of our brains and bodies? Could there be evidence of this on the other end of the scale, on a macro level, in our readily observable lives? Well, the narrative I read to start this talk was written by Linda, my friend and a retired ER physician. Now, I've known Linda for about 40 years, maybe a little longer, but it wasn't until about 2 years ago that she told me this story, her recollection of a medical catastrophe during which she was seemingly transported to a place of incredible peace and unearthly color, was drawn to a being of light, felt a love that trumped even that of a mother for her newborn daughter, and then was returned to her normal existence. It's the story of, as you may be aware, a near-death experience, or NDE for short. Something I mentioned very briefly in my talk last year, but which I'd like to discuss in a bit more depth today, because it may just hold some important clues to the mystery of consciousness and what, if anything, awaits us all after death. Though near-death experiences may have recently gained some familiarity and traction in the popular zeitgeist through such films as Angel Studios' After Death and the Netflix documentary Surviving Death, NDEs are neither novel nor uncommon. Accounts of NDEs appear in both ancient Greek and Roman sources and across all major religious traditions and indigenous peoples. About 5% of the general population have had NDEs. That's 1 in 20, so look around you. And 10 to 20% of all patients who have come close to death. That's 410 million people living today, 17 million of them right here in the United States. But so what? These are all just stories when it comes down to it, right? They're just anecdotes, really. Nothing solid, nothing you can corroborate, nothing to measure or analyze, hardly the scientific evidence to which I alluded earlier. Well, 2 things about that. It's not as if anecdotes are worthless. In fact, throughout history, anecdotes have been the starting point of most scientific hypotheses and investigations, and it's not as if anecdotes hold no probative value of their own. Consider skydiving. There have never been any prospective, double-blinded, placebo-controlled studies proving that parachutes save skydivers' lives. No one would sign up for the control group. All of the evidence in favor of parachutes is therefore technically anecdotal. Nevertheless, you'll never see me jumping from a plane without one. You'll never see me jumping from a plane with one either, but the point is that anecdotes do have value in the evaluation of reality. Moreover, the more anecdotes you have, the more you can start to recognize patterns, pull out commonalities, analyze differences. In other words, as the political scientist Raymond Wolfinger remarked half a century ago, the plural of anecdote is data, and data can be evaluated scientifically. Well, interestingly, despite having compiled more than a millennium of such anecdotes, the scientific approach to near-death experiences until recently has been primarily to simply ignore them. But this began to change in the 1970s when Dr. Raymond Moody first published his best-selling book, Life After Life. It was, to a large degree, just a collection of anecdotes from his practice and his interviews of 150 experiencers, but he did establish the first set of commonalities which distinguish NDEs. Number one, an overwhelming feeling of peace and well-being. Number two, the impression of being outside one's body. Number three, floating through darkness or a tunnel. Number four, becoming aware of a light. Hence our commonly repeated joke to stay away from the light or go to the light, depending on how you feel about the other person. Number five, encountering or communicating with a being of light. 90% of experiencers will report this. Number six, a rapid succession of images from one's past, sometimes referred to as a life review. And number seven, experiencing another world of intense beauty, somewhat like Linda's Green Hill. Dr. Moody garnered a great deal of criticism from skeptics. He had no statistical analysis of data, and some of his conclusions were considered simplistic and outright flawed, but his book stimulated both public and professional interest in the subject, and subsequently a small group of researchers in North America established the International Association for Near-Death Studies. Since then, the field's continued to expand and now includes contributions from a wide range of researchers and commentators worldwide. One of the most prominent of those early researchers, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who's the chief of psychiatry at the University of Connecticut, and a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatry Association, developed an interest in NDEs in his residency when his patient, Holly, accurately described the scene and the conversation he had had with another person in a different room while she was comatose and on life support. An atheist with no religious skin in the game, Dr. Grayson subsequently interviewed over 1,000 near-death experiencers in the course of his career, researched the plausibility of alternative explanations for the phenomenon, and subjected his observations to the kind of statistical analysis and peer review that Dr. Moody had been missing. Among his findings, number one, our brains process NDEs like events that really happened, not like hallucinations or dreams. In fact, experiencers will commonly describe their events as, quote, more real than real. Number two, unlike dreams and hallucinations, NDEs lead to profound and long-lasting after effects, increased appreciation of life and concern for others, increased self-esteem and sense of purpose, reduced fear of death and reduced fear of life, more willing to take risks. Number three, near-death experiences are not related to electrical activity in the brain. They are not related to low oxygen states, and they are not related to medicines or drugs given near the time of the event. Number four, experiencers report extreme clarity of thought during their events and senses that are extraordinarily expanded, often beyond their ability to describe later. Try to draw an odor, one experiencer remarked. That's what it's like describing NDEs with words. People who are deaf report being able to hear during their experience. People who have been blind since birth accurately report what they saw around them as they looked down on their bodies. Number 5, NDEs often contradict the experiencer's religion or previous beliefs about an afterlife. And finally, number 6, on the other hand, many features of NDEs are consistent across different countries and different cultures, no matter the unique beliefs within that culture. A model of scientific restraint, Dr. Grayson concludes in his best-selling book, After, quote, "I don't know whether some kind of continued consciousness after death is the best explanation for NDEs, but I don't have any alternative explanation for the evidence. We may eventually come up with another explanation, but until then, some form of consciousness after death seems to be the most plausible working model." End quote. One of the most interesting features of an NDE is an out-of-body experience. It's also one of the most common. And fortunately, in the interest of scientific investigation, it's the most objectively verifiable. You can't take a selfie while you're brain dead to prove that you saw a bright light, but investigators can compare your description of what you experienced around your lifeless body to what is actually on the medical record. Take the case of Pam Reynolds. In 1991, at age 35, she was diagnosed with a brain aneurysm that required an extremely risky surgery to repair. Her body temperature was lowered to 60 degrees. Her blood was drained from her body for nearly an hour. Her eyes were taped shut and speakers covered her ears to help test for brain waves during the procedure, but her EEG was flat. There was no brain activity. Fortunately, she survived the procedure. But the story she told upon awakening baffled her surgeons. During the procedure, she became aware that she was looking down at her body. The surgeon had told her he was going to use a saw, but she was confused. He was holding what looked to be a toothbrush. The toothbrush made a sound which, due to her perfect pitch, she was able to identify as a D on the musical scale. She heard the nurse say during the procedure that her arteries were too small. She then became aware of another presence and was drawn to a light, but returned to her body when she felt 2 shocks to her chest. Upon awakening, she told her surgeon all of this, and she was right about all of it. She did receive 2 shocks to the heart rather than the usual one. The surgeon did use a saw that looked like a toothbrush. That saw was subsequently tested and was found to produce a D pitch. The nurse did say during the procedure that her arteries were too small. All of this while she was under anesthesia, no heartbeat, no brain waves, eyes taped shut, ears masked. Her surgeon, Dr. Robert Spetzler, had this to say in a 2007 interview, quote, "There was absolutely no question that Pam Reynolds was clinically dead. Her EEG was completely flat, and her evoked potential, too, was completely gone. I believe that Pam recalled things that were remarkably accurate. I do not understand from a physiological perspective how that could have possibly happened. From a scientific perspective, there is no acceptable explanation." End quote. Pam's experience is one of the most famous accounts of a verifiable out-of-body experience, being the subject of a CBS documentary, but it's hardly the only one. 80% of all experiencers report a sense of being out of their bodies during the event, and their descriptions of events are amazingly on point. In a study of the observations reported by NDE experiencers during their events, Dr. Jan Holden found that 92% were completely accurate, 6% had some mistakes, and only 1% were completely inaccurate. And 40% of experiencers were able to correctly describe events occurring outside the rooms in which their bodies lay. Now, If, as Annika Harris claims, consciousness arises from the brain, is in fact identical to the brain, how could any of that be? Not just that 92% of the out-of-body experiencers were completely accurate, but that any of them were accurate. It should not be possible. Well, I think it's important to remember here that the idea of the brain as the source of consciousness, much like Newton's law of gravity, is only a model. And as such, much like Newton's law of gravity, it's often useful in a practical sense, but it may not be entirely an accurate description of reality. It doesn't explain all the data. The brain as originator of consciousness certainly doesn't explain NDEs, which is why I think that NDEs are often poo-pooed by the scientific community. It's easier to ignore data that doesn't fit. And that's unfortunately especially true in medicine, where we're supposed to have all the answers but rarely do. As I often admitted to my patients, we don't like saying we don't know. But as the neuroscientist Charles Whitehead noted in a remarkably honest recognition of the natural human tendency toward laziness, even in scientific thinking, quote, "Anomalies tend to get swept under the carpet until there are so many of them that the furniture starts to fall over," end quote. Well, perhaps we're at that tipping point now. Perhaps we need a new model of consciousness. Okay, like what? Well, NDE experiencer Robert, quote, "My thoughts were moving so quickly at this point, I was amazed to find that my mind seemed to be understanding at the same high speed. Everything was so clear and simple." Kim Clark, "I was learning the answers to the questions of life. I felt as if I was re-remembering things I had once known, and it seemed incredible that I had not figured out these things before now." And Steve Luting, who survived drowning, "I felt free from my brain. My mind expanded. It's made me think that our understanding of the brain is backwards. The brain filters everything. It doesn't help our thinking, it slows it down." A filter of consciousness rather than the source. You may be surprised to learn that more and more scientists are considering this model. The brain as a device for the mind to act more effectively on the physical body, to focus our thoughts on the physical world, a filter to block out information the body doesn't need for survival. But where then does consciousness reside, if not in the body? And what is consciousness, if not a function of the brain? NDE experiencer Barbara Whitfield, "I saw and experienced my childhood trauma again, just as I had lived it. But not only was I me, I was also my mother and my dad and my brother. We were all one." British neuropathologist and NDE experiencer Greg O'Connor, quote, "And this is where it gets very difficult to explain, but there's almost like a thread of light or energy that connected all of us together. There's one consciousness, really, and that's why it makes me laugh when we judge other people, because we're really just judging ourselves." And Anita Morhani, "In my experience, I became the source, and there was total clarity. We all come from unity into separation and then return to the whole. I could refer to it as God or the Brahman or the all that is." Unity. One consciousness. A consciousness that we're all a part of, all connected. A consciousness, as quantum physics at least suggests, that underlies and creates physical reality. A consciousness of love and peace and light from which we all came, and to which we all will eventually return. Could this be a model worth considering? Well, a warning and a recommendation. I don't know whether any of this is true. You're probably thinking I probably should have told you that 20 minutes ago. I don't know whether my friend Linda's experience and the experience of millions of others around the world represent glimpses of a reality beyond the material and a continuation of consciousness in some form or other after death, or if they are, in some way we just don't yet understand, simply the products of traumatized brain. I have my own beliefs and conclusions that are based on the data, and they dovetail quite nicely with the theories of consciousness being developed from the world of quantum physics to produce a coherent, albeit somewhat fuzzy, sketch of reality, one that makes more sense to me than that of my purely materialistic friends. But as celebrated neuroscientist and author Brian Cox has said, in science, there are no universal truths, just views of the world that have yet to be shown to be false. And that applies just as much to my admittedly unconventional ideas as it does to the logical and amoral, and that's amoral, not immoral, world of pure materialism. There are counter-arguments to much of what I've discussed, proposed by researchers working in good faith, if you will. Many of them a bit of a reach, in my opinion, influenced by the biases of the researchers and in ignoring inconvenient bits of data. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, at least not entirely. So it behooves me to approach things here with a little bit of humility. In the words of one of my favorite scientists, I'm probably wrong. Undoubtedly in some of it, and possibly in all of it. But there's a 17th century philosophical argument called Pascal's wager, you may have heard of it, which submits that it's the smart move to believe in God's existence because the potential infinite and eternal reward for believing, if God does in fact exist, outweighs the finite and temporary loss one would suffer in one lifetime for this belief if God doesn't exist. I actually had a pastor once admit to me that this was part of the basis for his own faith. And I hate this argument, as it turns faith really into a matter of pragmatic self-interest rather than truth or moral imperative. However, I'm going to use a variant of it here to suggest a very pragmatic conclusion to our discussion. Given the scientific study of near-death experiences that suggests the possibility that consciousness originates outside the brain and may continue after death in some form or fashion and for some amount of time, and given the experiments in quantum physics that suggest the possibility that consciousness is the true underlying substrate of the universe, a consciousness we may all be a part of, the cause of material reality rather than the result, whether you call that underlying consciousness God or not, given those two things, isn't it the better bet for us to act on those possibilities in our daily lives? To live as if there may be more to the world and to us than cold, predetermined chemical reactions and illusion of self? To experience and enjoy life to its fullest, willing to accept some risks, because this might be only a brief stop in our journey, rather than to desperately cling on to every moment of this life, fearful of its own inevitable and definitive obliteration. To recognize and appreciate in our daily interactions with others that we all may in fact be one, as the Eastern religions and even St. Thomas of Aquinas in the Christian tradition have long held. To judge not, lest we ourselves be judged. To fully embrace the very real possibility that doing unto others is doing unto ourselves. Think about that. It's a powerful idea. For each of us individually, to be sure, but also for our communities, for our world, and its future. And maybe it's not true. But what do we got to lose? My friend Linda, sitting there, thinks it's true. At least her experience, maybe not my conclusions. Millions of others think it's true too, based on their own experiences. More real than real, they often remark. I don't think science will ever know for sure, and that's partly by design. Science never knows for sure. But being open to the possibility, the scientific possibility, that we may be more than the physical, that something of us may outlast our deaths, maybe not sitting on clouds and playing harps, but in a way much grander, much more peaceful, much more loving, giving, forgiving, and connected. Being open to that possibility has the potential to change our lives, and as a result, the lives of all of those around us. Well, maybe this is all just retirement talking. The musings of an aging guy who suddenly has too much time on his hands on those long morning walks. But I'll take that wager, because it makes sense of the world, of reality. Because for now, it's at least consistent with the science. And because it's definitely a much safer bet than my pickleball game.